Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today. We'll be covering the topic of the winter of our discontent. My name's Hannah and we'll be joined by Zane very shortly, who'll be hosting our webinar today. We expect this webinar will run for about 30 to 40 minutes and we will open the floor at the end of the session today for a bit of a Q&A. So if any questions that you do have, please pop them in the chat as we go and we look forward to answering them at the end of today. Otherwise, Zane, I might hand over to you and we can get started.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And I hope today's going to be really interesting. We've got some fascinating material to talk about. There's some great research that I'm going to bring forward for discussion. And I think you'll find it quite relevant to what's happening here in Australia and certainly overseas, because UK is going to be a discussion or point of some of the discussion this afternoon. So I've entitled the session today, "The Winter of Our Discontent," which of course is a famous quote, but it does seem to be rather apt in the circumstance. So we're going to start out today with just a little look at some of the recent events in the UK. Now, of course, last month they had the 2024 election. Now, the election was a snap election, so the term of the government didn't run full term. And many people were quite surprised that the government had called this election. The reality is that, seen for the Tory party, that their fortunes had been fading in the electorate. So many have assumed that they went to the polls to avert a complete catastrophe. However, it's really interesting to look at the outcomes of the election there. So I've just got a few points on the screen here. This really was an historic election. It set a whole lot of records, and not necessarily in a good way. So you'll notice there, this was the worst Conservative result in terms of seats in history. They have only retained 121 seats out of more than 600. So that's a very, very poor result for the party. Now, just to put that into perspective, seven sitting cabinet ministers lost their own seats. So that was a very, very blunt reality for the party in the electorate. Now, of course, the UK has different parts. You've got England, you've got Scotland, you've got Wales and Northern Ireland. And as an outcome of the election, there are now no Tory MPs in Wales, none at all, not one. And the same is true of Scotland. So in those parts of the United Kingdom, they suffered really, really quite a liberating or quite a deafening defeat. And for Labor, on the other side, they now have a majority of 174 seats. Now, that is the largest majority since 1931. So that, again, has set another record. Now, it's interesting on the other side of the equation that this election saw the lowest voter turnout since 2001. Now, of the registered electors, only 59.4% of voters, so the registered voters, only 59.4% of them actually voted. And in addition to that, it's estimated that up to 8 million eligible people didn't even register to vote. So in this election where there was so much change, this massive swing to the Labor Party, there was also a record level of unengagement where the population simply were disengaging at levels never before experienced. And I'd like to suggest today, based on the statistics, that we're seeing some very interesting trends reflected in the election that are actually coming from society more generally. Now, some people have coined this decade a reckless decade in the UK. And there's a number of factors that have been driving this. Now, of course, the COVID pandemic started the decade off, and that caused some flow-on issues. There were economic issues from that, and certainly a lot of instability. So this decade for the UK has been marked by economic crises. Of course, there was COVID. Brexit has also had a massive impact on the economy in a negative way. There's been a lot of political instability. You remember with the Conservatives that there was a number of changes of Prime Minister in very short order. And it almost seemed at one stage there if the party was turning on itself. And in society, we've had a lot of social unrest. This has been caused by a whole range of factors. The pandemic contributed to that. The economics have contributed to that. And there are parts of the country that are really experiencing massive level of downturn, both socially and economically. So that's driving that unrest. Also, climate. Climate has been a significant factor in this decade. Some of you who visit the UK from time to time may remember a couple of summers ago that they experienced record temperatures into the early 40s. A typical summer in the UK, mid-20s, you're getting hot. So they're experiencing the impact of this climate, which has had a flow-on effect to farming and just the whole social fabric because of the way housing and their building and estates, how those are set up to manage the cold and heat. So certainly a big impact from climate. So you've got this background that's driving what's happening in the community. And this in turn is having an impact on how people are viewing their government, viewing their government institutions, and certainly viewing their politicians. So from some Ipsos research that was released recently, 67% of Britons say that politicians pay too little attention to public opinion and to the evidence when making decisions. So what that means is only 33% of the population believes that they are paying sufficient attention to that. Now, if you notice the trend there, that's a jump from 54% in 2023 to 67% in 2024. That's a massive increase. That's an increase of over 10% in just 1 year. So you can see there's a trend that's emerging here that's not very good for government. When it comes to ethics in government, this is something that's very topical at the moment. We're seeing lots of news stories, not only in the UK, but here in Australia, about ethical behaviour or otherwise in the government. So when it comes to thinking about the Conservative government that was voted out, 65% of Britons did not think the people in the Conservative government that was just voted out behaved according to high ethical standards. So 2/3 of the population didn't think that their government was acting ethically. And here's a direct quote from a bit of research that was done by the Institute for Government in the UK. There is a widespread sense that people in positions of power do not believe that the usual rules apply to them, or that UK government more generally is not working for the benefit of the public. So really, really strong commentary coming through from the research about what's happening within the population. Now, this points to a broader trend globally too around this issue of populism. Now, populism is a really interesting thing, and if you wanted to define populism, simply put, it's an approach, it's a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who appear to feel that their concerns are being disregarded by established groups. So it really sets out to set the elite, or who are considered to be the elite, against the ordinary person. And it's had quite a rise around the globe. And since the UK election, of course, we've seen the French election. We've got an election coming up in the US, which this is very much a factor. And we're even seeing some of this sort of trend in Australia. But look what's happening in the UK. 68% of people in Britain say the country's in decline. And this is post-Brexit. And there's a lot of pessimism about the future there. 70% agree the economy is rigged to advantage the rich and powerful, and 71% say the political and economic elite don't care about hard-working people. So these factors directly point to the rise of populism in the UK. Now that negativity is also pointed toward public services, and this is where we start to get a little bit of interested too, because it's one thing to talk about government, but then how does that translate into the way that people are using or viewing public services? Well, 76% of people in the UK believe that services have worsened in the last 5 years. And on the other side of that, only one in seven, believes that they're going to improve in the next 5 years. So there's this perception, whether real or not, that things are getting worse in terms of public services and that they're not going to get any better. Now, the issue of trust is another really interesting issue in this mix of factors. So from a couple of pieces of research here, one done by Ipsos and also the Veracity Index 2023, which is done by Ipsos, trust in politicians in 23 fell to a low of 9%. And that's the lowest since the survey started in 1983. Only 9% of people trust politicians. And that's a big issue for a democratic country where the people elect the politicians. So a major factor in the political environment there. And here's another interesting piece of research from YouGov poll. Only 4% of British people believe that parliamentarians are doing the best for their country. So 96% of people don't believe that the parliamentarians are doing the best for the country. Another really concerning statistic. Well, that's the situation in the UK, but what about here in Australia? Are we different? Are things better, or are we following a similar pathway? Well, so there's some interesting research that the APSC does, and these statistics here, this statistic is from a trust satisfaction in Australian democracy research that the APSC published. And 49% of people think that corruption is widespread in Australia's democratic institutions and processes. So the numbers are not as large as the UK, but nonetheless, they are very, very significant. And here's a few other insights from research, this time conducted by Ipsos in Australia. Half of Australians believe that our society is broken. So there's 50% believe that we're not in a good place. Now, the next point here, this harkens back to this populism view. 2/3 of Australians believe that the economy is rigged to advantage the rich and powerful. So that's straight out of the populist playbook right there. More than 57% of Australians agree that traditional parties and politicians don't care about people like me. So again, that's that populist notion that it's a juxtaposition between the politically elite and the ordinary person. And finally, 2/3 of Australians believe that Australia needs a strong leader to take the country back from the rich and powerful. And notice this one, while over half think the nation needs a strong leader willing to break the rules. Now, I don't know about you, but I find those numbers quite staggering and quite concerning too, because these are the views that are held in our community right at this time. And this is another interesting number from the APSC research. 74% of people in Australia do not trust the political parties. So another really big number in terms of the attitude, the perception of people in our community towards the government and government institutions. Okay. Well, that kind of sets the scene for our discussion today. And it's really interesting. We need to ask the question, what does this mean to me? What does this mean to my organisation? And this is the bottom line. If you're a government organisation, there is a negative prevailing attitude to you, and that'll be based around one of three things. Number one is your integrity. So whether you're doing what you're doing in good faith, whether or not it's a level playing field for everyone, whether you are acting in the best interests of your customers, the Australian community, or if you're more interested in feathering your own nest. So there's this real concern around the integrity that people perceive may not be present in the government organisations that are serving them. Second one is around competence. This can also impact people's thinking. So the public perception about public services that actually work, government organisations that are actually equipped and deliver competent services, they do what they set out to do. So that can be also a driver in this. And finally, another really important one, this is the issue of goodwill. So does our community view government organisations as approaching their customers with an empathetic view? Do they hold some goodwill to them and genuinely seek to support and help? So these are the issues that affect the attitudes that people hold to us. So if they think that your organisation is compromised or on one or more of these issues, that's going to drive those negative attitudes within our community, which has long-reaching impacts. Now, while we can't influence directly what people think, we can influence the way that we deliver, the way that we run our organisation. So we need to ask not about the things that we can't do, but we really need to focus on the things that we actually can do. What can organisations do in this really negative environment? What can organisations do to help encourage a more positive attitude within their community towards the organisations and towards the government? So that's what we're going to think about for the balance of the time this afternoon. Now, by the way, if you have any questions or comments, you feel free to hold them for the end, and then we'll have a bit of discussion time to reflect on some of these issues. So one of the key things is what we need to be thinking about: what active steps can we take to create or rebuild and maintain trust with our stakeholders? Because that's what it all comes down to. If they don't trust our integrity, if they don't trust our competence, if they don't trust that we're acting with goodwill, then everything is going to be a struggle from that point. So this issue of trust is a really, really important issue. And you saw in those statistics that trust is at a very, very low level in our community right now. So let's focus on three of the keys of trust. And I'm going to suggest to you that number one, integrity is really, really important. And often it's around the way that people actually see our integrity. Do they view us as having integrity? Secondly, accountability. So do they see our organisations as having accountability as an organisation? And do they see that the people within our organisations, do they see our leaders, our political leaders, as having accountability? And finally, we're also going to have a little bit of think about transparency and communication. Do they see us as being transparent? Are we willing to be transparent around the important things? And are we communicating proactively with our stakeholders about those things? Now, I just want to take a moment just to reflect on something that happened in the UK in recent times. Now, you'll probably recognise the picture on the left there. That's the former Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson. And of course, he is no longer the Prime Minister. He resigned after a number of political scandals. Now, the person on the right, his name is Chris Pincher, and he was a former UK politician, and the two stories here are kind of intertwined. So we'll start with the Chris Pincher Chris Pincher scandal. So that goes back to July 2022 when there were allegations of sexual misconduct by Pincher, and they were made, and the government at that time initially denied that at the time of Pincher's appointment, Prime Minister Boris Johnson had any knowledge of those specific complaints of a similar nature. Now, Boris Johnson later had to admit that that was not the case, and that raised questions about his denials and why Johnson nevertheless had chosen to appoint him as the deputy whip of the Conservative Party. Now, this scandal sparked a major crisis for Johnson's government, with their ministers and a large number of government staff actually resigning between the 5th and the 7th of July in 2022. So the fact that the party had refused to acknowledge the issue, or its leadership had refused to acknowledge the issue and deal with it, meant that there were a lot of senior resignations that occurred at that time. So that really was part of a bigger pattern which slowly began to unravel the Johnson government. Now, you may remember, even on this side of the world, we heard about what's now been known as Partygate, and that was a political scandal in the UK about gatherings of both government and the Conservative Party during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, like in Australia, there were very strict public health restrictions made, and basically for periods of time prohibiting public gatherings. However, as came out later, there were quite a number of gatherings of the Conservative Party and staff during that time. The first report was on 30th November 2021, and that was by the Daily Mirror, and that was talking about staff gatherings during the 2020 Christmas seasons where they were having Christmas parties. Johnson said the rules had been followed, and Downing Street actually denied that a party took place. In January 2022, there were 12 gatherings came under investigation by the Metropolitan Police, including at least 3 of those attended by Boris Johnson. Now, as a result of that investigation, the police issued 126 penalty notices to 83 individuals, including Johnson, his wife, Rishi Sunak, who was the then Chancellor of the Exchequer and currently the Prime Minister of the UK. They all apologised and paid the penalties. But this was all building up a pattern of lack of integrity, lack of accountability, and certainly not transparency. So in early 22, a number of opposition and a few Conservative politicians called for Johnson's resignation, and ultimately he did resign. But there are those 3 issues: integrity, accountability, and transparency. So they're things that are really, really important for us to be mindful of when we're thinking about how we operate as entities. So with these 3 things in mind, and the difficult climate that we're currently operating in, I'd like to pose a question today, and that is, can GRC help us in managing trust? Do we already have some tools in the tool chest that we can bring to bear to help us solve this problem? Well, let's just think about what GRC is for a moment. Now, I really like this definition, and interestingly, it comes from the Open Compliance and Ethics Group. Now, this was the group that actually first coined the term GRC. And then they said that GRC is the critical capabilities that must work together to achieve principled performance. I really like that term, principled performance, because it's not just a matter of getting the job done, it's a matter of doing it in a principled way so that people trust us, our stakeholders trust us. Principled performance, the capabilities that integrate the governance, management, and assurance of performance, risk, and compliance activities. So that's a really nice definition of GRC. And let's look at a definition of governance from the Governance Institute of Australia. It encompasses the system by which an organisation is controlled and operates, and the mechanisms by which it and its people are held to account. Ethics, risk management, compliance, and administration are all elements of governance. Now, notice we've got that ethical focus there. The other definition talked about principled performance, and here, right at the start of that sentence, we've got ethics. So this notion of integrity is really, really important in the way we operate if we are to be effective. So let's think about how we might bring GRC then to bear on the issue of integrity. Now, there are a lot of occasions when the integrity of individuals within government organisations is called into question, and some of those end up in the media. So it's something the public takes a keen issue in. And for that reason, I believe that integrity is a key strategic risk for all government organisations today. If you want to damage your reputation, you have an integrity scandal, it will happen very, very quickly. So integrity, to my mind, is a really important strategic risk. And that means that as organisations, we should be identifying the risks to integrity. Now, over on the right-hand side there on that little graphic on the screen this afternoon, I've got some of the ways that integrity issues have been manifest in the last decade or so. If you look at all of those things, you can probably recall occasions when people have ended up in the media for all of the wrong reasons in relation to them. So what that means is we have to identify those things that pose a risk to integrity and then put appropriate controls around that. And as organisations, we have tools that can very simply and effectively do that. For example, we have full control over our internal frameworks and policy. So if you're a Commonwealth entity, that means that you can include elements relating to integrity around things like gifts and benefits and hospitality, travel and procurement. You can do that in your AIs. You can put controls in your systems to make sure that the right processes are followed, the right approvals are gained, and that there is good scrutiny within your organisation to make sure that the behaviour is appropriate. So we all have the power to put those controls in place. The final point I'd just like to make on the issue of integrity is tone at the top. If staff in an entity don't see that senior executive and senior leadership are leading by example, you're going to have a really hard time selling it to the rest of the organisation. It is so important that leadership lead by word and example. So it's not just what they say, it's also what they do. So having these pro-integrity cultures is really, really important to gain and preserve the trust of our stakeholders. So there's a few thoughts about integrity. Now, what about accountability? Often things happen, but when you look around, no one seems to have been held accountable for it. And accountability is so important. And as entities, we can include accountability mechanisms in policy and process with consequences. And that is so important. You know, I've heard of situations where there are rules in place, but the compliance with those rules is not high because people know that if they do something wrong, there's no accountability, so it actually doesn't matter. So we can have frameworks in place, we can have policy in place, but unless those mechanisms include accountability mechanisms, then we're going to be struggling. So those accountability mechanisms become really, really important where people are held to account. And that also means there, and this goes to the second point I've got here, that we need to actively monitor for and record and respond to non-compliance. So if something goes wrong, if someone does step over the line, then the organisation needs to respond to that and deal with it appropriately. Now, that leads us to the third point here. To be effective, accountability has got to be timely. So it needs to happen in good order rather than putting it off and deferring. It needs to be timely. It needs to be even-handed. So it doesn't matter who you are in the organisation, if that's the rule, everyone gets treated the same way. It has to be applied consistently, and it has to be transparent to the extent that a particular process can be transparent. It's when organisations hide things that really should be visible that people just start to get more mistrusting of what's actually going on. So transparency is a really important part of accountability. Acknowledging that sometimes for privacy concerns and other reasons that full transparency is not possible, but a reasonable level of transparency is very, very important. And that reinforces the message that integrity is important to the organisation. All right, so we've talked about integrity, we've talked about accountability and some of the things that we can do in the GRC space. And notice here these the words in yellow: policy, processes. These are GRC things: monitoring, recording, responding to non-compliance. This is core GRC. So there are things we can do with our existing GRC tools to foster accountability. All right, let's have a think of the third one now: transparency and communication. So around transparency, good governance means that we're going to be proactive in managing integrity. And for example, we can require timely declarations and independent approvals. And by doing that, we're actually gaining information from the people involved, which we can then communicate to our stakeholders in appropriate ways. And if we're not getting that information, then we can't do that. And we should be proactive in providing regular information reports out to our stakeholders. Now, if you're not collecting information about integrity, that means you can't actually share any information with stakeholders. So, for example, one of the duties of officials in the PGPA Act is that all conflicts of interest must be declared. And I'd like to ask you a question today. How does your organisation know, or what assurance does it get that all of your staff have reported conflicts of interest? Well, that's where assurance comes in, and that's where GRC provides us with excellent tools to do that. So you imagine if you went out even once a year to all of your staff and asked them just to confirm that if they had any conflicts of interest currently, though that they had been declared, or if they hadn't, this would be an opportunity to do that. So being proactive in monitoring compliance and seeking assurance from our internal stakeholders about some of those relevant things, such as conflict of interest. So that's what we mean by being proactive about managing integrity. And then with that data, we can actually go to our stakeholders and say, well, by the way, conflict of interest is a really, really important issue for us. And because of that, we go to all of our staff once a year and ask them to provide a declaration that all conflicts have been declared. So that's the sort of proactive information. By showing people what we're doing, by telling them what we're doing, that can build confidence and trust in our organisation. Now, transparency and communication can be misused as well. And I've just made a final observation here on this point. When things go wrong, it's really, really important that we admit mistakes. When we try and hide things or, pass the blame or obfuscate, that is not helpful, particularly when the truth ultimately comes out. So it really defuses the whole situation when we can just admit, that a mistake was made, an error was made, and that we want to do all that we can to to correct whatever has happened. The absolute worst thing that we can do is obfuscate or spin. And the public, our stakeholders, can see right through that and just make things worse. And I believe, in Western countries that are really struggling with these issues of trust, that talking plainly and honestly and openly with our stakeholders really, really important to rebuild that trust. Because as soon as we try to start spin things or hide things, it really sends a negative message about what we're actually trying to do. So we've got these three areas where our governance tools can all provide quite a lot of help to us. So integrity, risk management. So actually identifying integrity as a risk, really, really important. Our controls, another really important about GRC. Have we got appropriate controls around our integrity? Accountability. So again, policy and process, a core part of GRC, including those mechanisms in there. Monitoring, recording, responding to non-compliance, compliance, another really important part of GRC. And, good governance, being proactive in managing integrity, providing information out by reporting to our stakeholders, another really, really important part of GRC. So I'd like to suggest to you today that we already have well-established, well-known tools in our kit bag that can be brought to this issue of trust, rebuilding confidence with our stakeholders. And we can't do everything, but we can certainly start taking steps to make sure those things are in place in our organisation. So finally, just like to leave you with 5 things. 5 questions that you can ask in your organisation to assess your governance, assess your GRC around integrity. Number 1, does your organisation have a visible pro-integrity culture? You should be able to ask any member of your staff that question, and they will know, they can tell you, does your organisation have a visible pro-integrity culture? Number 2, is integrity managed as a strategic risk and as an operational risk? So yes, it is a strategic risk, but it's also an operational risk in everything you do. So when we're doing a risk assessment for a procurement, are we considering integrity issues as one of the risks around that procurement? So we need to bring that to our operational life as well. Number 3, do we have appropriate controls around key integrity risks? So give some benefits. What controls have we got in place? Have we got mechanisms to require staff to report that? Have we got delegates in place, appropriate delegates who consider those requests and make principled decisions? Have we got governance mechanisms to record all of that information, the decisions, so that we can defend our decisions? So having appropriate controls around key integrity risks is really important. Number 4, do we undertake regular assurance around integrity? How do we do it? What mechanisms are in place? What are we doing right now? Maybe more importantly, what should we be doing, or what can we do to further strengthen that? And finally, is there accountability around integrity? So when someone gets it wrong, when someone does the wrong thing, are they held to account? So 5 questions that we can ask in our organisations to assess our governance around integrity. So I hope that you find those useful. Well, Hannah, we might just swing into Q&A mode now. So I don't know if any questions have come through. So what have we got there?
Yeah, thanks, Zane. Great presentation. I know I got lots out of it, so I'm sure everyone at home did as well. We've had about 3 questions come through so far, so we might rattle those off, and if anyone's got any additional questions, just pop them in the chat, and we'd be happy to answer them as well. So Zane, the first one someone's popped in is, they mentioned that you showed some statistics that indicate that populism is on the rise. Why do you think this is happening, is their question?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and there's been quite a bit of research that's been done on that. One of the things with populism, it seems to depend on the context of where it's occurring. So, for example, in places like some of the Asian countries, some of the Latin countries, in South America, it's a lot of it's around corruption. Governments and government officials are often seen as corrupt, so that really brings into sharp focus, this idea of the political elite versus the ordinary person, how everything's stacked against it. In Western Europe and the UK, a lot of it's around immigration. Uh, they see immigration as really creating a lot of issues. If you go to the former Eastern Europe, a lot of it's around transformation fatigue. Obviously, the Iron Curtain fell at the end of the 80s, and there's been massive change, in the last few decades. And some of the people in those countries are really, feeling fatigued from all of that. Uh, in other countries, it's resentment by people hit by cultural, social, and political changes. And the interesting one for places like the US, Australia, and UK, there's also this factor of resentment, and this seems to be particularly under white males, and that's being fueled by rising inequality and employment issues. And now that can be geographically isolated, or it can be in a particular industry sector, and that stokes that. And I think the other big factor, which we can't forget, is social media. In the last few years, the rise of social media. Some people have described that as an echo chamber, which exacerbates, sentiment in the community. So people are getting angry, that just amplifies that and spreads it further. So those are a few of the factors that I think have driven this populist, populist rise in many of the countries around the globe.
Awesome. Thanks, Zane. And if anyone has any follow-up questions to that point, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can circle back in a moment. Otherwise, you might jump to our next question. So Zane, this one is asking, what else can we do to build integrity in our public institutions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've just sort of provided a few ideas here this afternoon. Obviously, we don't have a lot of time, but that's a big question, and there are lots of things that we can do. I think one of the things that we can do is really simple to do, is to actually signal both within our organisations and outside of our organisations that integrity is really important to us. So saying to our staff, having senior leadership communicate to their staff in a whole range of ways that integrity is important. It's something that matters to us. And that's why we have these controls. That's why we have these mechanisms. That's why we have these processes. And that's why we hold you accountable to that. And I think that's a really powerful thing to do. Now, the danger is that if we don't follow through, then that just exacerbates the problem of trust. So when we signal something, it's really important then that we follow through and that we demonstrate that we actually mean it and that we're going to follow through when issues do occur. It'd be really interesting too, in the comments, if anyone wanted to throw in the chat any thoughts they've got on that question, because I think it's a really, really good question. And I think, particularly for those joining us from government institutions today, it's a question that we should be talking about more. The practical things that we can do from day to day to build integrity and the perception of integrity in our public institutions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Zane. So if anyone has those, pop them in the chat, or if they come to mind after the session today, send myself or Zane an email. I'll send a follow-up as well to ask any of those questions, and we'd be happy to answer them as well. All right, Zane, it looks like we've got one more question so far. So this question is, do you think that being accountable can lead to a view that a person or an institution is incompetent?
It's a really great question. So if we're transparent and we admit we made a mistake, or something's gone wrong, will that lead people believe to take the view that we're incompetent? Well, I suppose that some people would be predisposed to think that if they heard that an institution they wanted to trust did let them down, that they might go straight to the view that they're incompetent. But look, I think for most people, no. I think we understand that we're all human. We understand sometimes that things go wrong, that things don't turn out as we want. I think the risk is if that happens repeatedly, then people might rightly ask if if actually we're competent to do the job. But I think most people understand that from time to time things go wrong, and if we're upfront and open about that, and say what we're going to do to put it right, I think that's really important, and that will actually enhance trust rather than lead to a view that we're incompetent. Hannah, I remember many years ago there was an ad on the television in New Zealand about a Wellington company called L.B. Martin and Son, and it's really stuck in my head because in their ad they said sometimes things go wrong, but it's the putting right that counts, and if something's not right, we'll put it right, and that's stuck with me. And they built an excellent business that had an excellent reputation in the community because people knew that if something went wrong, it would get sorted. And I think that's the sort of reputation that as government organisations, as other organisations, that we want to have. We want our stakeholders to understand that if something's wrong, we'll put it right. And I think that's a great place to be.
Absolutely. Well, I think in terms of questions that have come through, Zane, that might be all that we've got so far. But as mentioned, I will be sending through a copy of the recording from today's session shortly after the call today. And if anything does come to mind, please reach out to myself or Zane, and we'd be happy to, get on a call or answer any questions that you might have. Otherwise, Zane, I'm not sure if you have any closing remarks. Otherwise, we can give everyone a bit of maybe a 10-minute early mark.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, thank you everybody for your time today. In my view, integrity is one of the really important things of the moment. So integrity, organisations should be thinking about it now. Really, really important. And I hope that today's webinar has been helpful and maybe sparking some thoughts. And I encourage you to take those 5 questions away and just to do a little bit of a litmus test, a little bit of a self-assessment, and just see how you're faring. And if it sparks something positive in terms of building your integrity, then it's been worthwhile time today. So thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks, Zane. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.